So it's possibly the most famous letter in modern Jewish history, and it begins with 3 words: Dear Lord Rothschild.
In 1875, in a quiet room far from any battlefield, Britain made a move that would help decide the shape of global power for the next century. The target wasn't a fortress. It was a canal. The Suez Canal had been opened only a few years earlier, and it didn't just shorten a sea route. It compressed time itself between Europe and Asia, turning weeks of sailing around Africa into a direct corridor between the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. For an empire whose crown jewel was India, that corridor was a lifeline. So when Egypt's ruler needed cash and put a major block of Suez Canal Company shares on the table, the British government moved with unusual speed. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli turned to a private banking house in London, N.M. Rothschild and Sons, to front the money. £4 million, an enormous sum for the era, advanced fast enough to beat rivals and secure a strategic stake. That moment is often told like a single dramatic transaction. Money wired, empire secured, history changed. But it also opens a door into something bigger: the way finance became a second map of the world in the modern age, with its own borders, alliances, and pressure points. And few names are more associated, fairly and unfairly, with that financial map than the Rothschilds. Their story starts long before Suez, in a Europe where Jews were frequently pushed to the margins of public life, barred from land ownership or guilds, and often confined by local restrictions. In many places, lending money, especially where Christian prohibitions on usury shaped the market, became one of the narrow economic lanes available. The Rothschild surname itself points to a place, not a throne, zum Roten Schild, at the Red Shield, likely referring to a sign on a building in Frankfurt's Jewish quarter. The mythic versions of this story begin by pretending the family sprang into existence already powerful. The real version begins cramped, local, and precarious. A family working inside the rules and limits of their time. Frankfurt, in the 1700s, was a useful city to be from. It was a free imperial city, effectively a semi-independent hub in the Holy Roman Empire's patchwork of jurisdictions. Trade moved through it, information moved through it, and money, especially the money of princes who needed loans, soldiers, or supplies, flowed through it too. In 1744, Mayer Amschel Rothschild was born into that environment. He did not inherit an empire, he built relationships. As a young man, he trained with established financiers and returned to Frankfurt with a sharp sense of how credit and trust could be turned into leverage. One turning point came when he became closely linked to the wealth of a major German ruler, William of Hesse-Kassel, managing funds and providing services that made Mayer Amschel not merely a lender, but a financial operator inside elite networks. Then Europe detonated. The French Revolution began in 1789, and what followed, war after war, regime after regime, was more than politics. It was a stress test for the entire European financial system. Governments needed money at scales that normal taxation couldn't supply quickly enough. Armies had to be paid. Supplies had to be bought. Debts had to be refinanced. In that kind of chaos, banks that could move funds across borders, switch currencies, and maintain communications could become as strategically relevant as generals. This is where the Rothschild structure, often called the Five Arrows, became legendary. A family network spanning Frankfurt, London, Paris, Vienna, and Naples. It wasn't magic. It was logistics. In an era before instant communication, a family partnership across major capitals functioned like an early multinational. Faster internal messaging, shared intelligence, and the ability to raise capital where it was cheapest and lend it where it was most urgent. That advantage didn't mean they controlled governments. It meant governments sometimes depended on them, especially in moments of crisis, because the alternatives were slower, more expensive, or politically complicated. The Napoleonic Wars produced the most famous and most misunderstood chapter. The legend that the Rothschilds got rich from Waterloo has been retold 1,000 ways. Here's what's credible. They were active in bond markets, they used rapid information networks, and they were deeply involved in financing war efforts across Europe. This created opportunities and also accusations. Markets punish late information and reward early information. Even today, the difference between hearing news in seconds versus minutes can move billions. In 1815, the difference could be days. The Rothschilds' courier networks gave them speed that few could match. And speed, in finance, is power. But power in that era didn't look like a modern billionaire's dashboard. It looked like government bonds, rail concessions, mining stakes, and the ability to place loans large enough to stabilize or strain a treasury. When the wars ended, Europe entered a new phase: industrialization. Railways, ports, factories, and state infrastructure demanded oceans of capital. Investment banking, arranging debt, underwriting bonds, coordinating big projects became the plumbing of the modern world. In France, the Rothschild Bank helped finance industrial expansion and railway growth. In Britain, the family became intertwined with the state's financial machinery, including the bond market that funded imperial commitments across continents. And sometimes, those financial mechanisms touched the most morally charged parts of modern history. In 1833, Britain abolished slavery across most of its empire. The abolition was historic, but the way it was implemented revealed the priorities of power. The British state paid compensation not to the enslaved, but to slave owners, treating human beings as property being relinquished. Parliament authorized an immense compensation package of £20 million, about 40% of the Treasury's annual income at the time, often described as around 5% of GDP, an enormous fiscal shock. To raise funds, the government took on major borrowing. One key component was a £15 million loan finalized in 1835 involving Nathan Mayer Rothschild and Moses Montefiore. It's a brutal truth. The end of slavery in the British Empire was financed in part through debt, and that debt helped cushion the financial loss of enslavers, not the suffering of the enslaved. This is where a documentary has to slow down and be honest. The Rothschilds were not the authors of slavery. They didn't invent the compensation scheme, but they were present in the financial architecture that made it workable for the British state. That's the recurring pattern. They often didn't write the political decisions, but they funded the systems that executed those decisions. In the 19th century, funding a state could be as consequential as advising it. Now return to Suez, because Suez is the cleanest example of finance turning into geopolitics in a single motion. Disraeli's rapid purchase became a stepping stone toward deeper British involvement in Egypt, culminating in a protectorate era and long-term strategic dominance over a route critical to imperial shipping. The Rothschild loan didn't create empire, but it enabled a decisive imperial move at a critical moment. And with imperialism comes another theme: extraction. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, as anti-Semitic politics rose across Europe, Rothschild became a code word in propaganda, a way to personify finance as a shadow enemy. That propaganda wasn't just hateful, it was politically useful. Blaming a family was easier than explaining industrial shocks, bank failures, or the chaos of globalization. The 20th century proved how deadly that scapegoating could become. When the Nazis rose, Jewish families with visible wealth and prominence were targeted ideologically and materially. Assets were seized, banks were pressured or confiscated. Members of the family were threatened, arrested, or forced to flee as the map of Europe collapsed into occupation and genocide. The Rothschilds survived, but survival is not the same as continuity. Their world, the European world where private banking houses could sit at the center of power, was being replaced by something new: American-led finance, post-war institutions, regulated markets, and the decline of aristocratic banking dynasties. Even after the war, the relationship between politics and capital could still turn hostile. In France, for example, nationalization policies in the early 1980s hit major banks, including Rothschild-linked entities, as governments pursued state-led economic agendas. The old model, family banks as semi-private pillars of the state, kept shrinking. So, what are the Rothschilds today? Not a single monolithic vault, not a secret world government, and not the cartoon some corners of the internet still sell. The modern Rothschild universe is fragmented across branches, businesses, foundations, and investment vehicles. Some entities carry the historic name as part of corporate continuity. Others are separate family lines with their own structures. There is Rothschild and Company, operating in modern financial sectors with public reporting and regulatory oversight. And there are other Rothschild-branded or Rothschild-founded institutions across wealth management and private banking. In recent reporting, Rothschild & Co.'s asset management arm described net inflows and growth momentum in 2024, reflecting the more standard corporate language of a modern financial group rather than the mythic aura of a 19th-century house bank. It's also important to separate name recognition from net worth. In the 1800s, the Rothschilds were frequently described as among Europe's most powerful financiers because finance itself was concentrated among a smaller number of family houses, and states relied on them for war loans and infrastructure. In the 2000s, global wealth is dispersed among tech founders, sovereign wealth funds, pension funds, and institutional investors managing trillions. The Rothschilds remain wealthy and influential in certain circles, but not uniquely so in the way they once were. Claims that they control trillions are typically not backed by transparent accounting and often echo old propaganda patterns. A modern symbol of the shift is the way the Rothschild story now blends finance with culture and philanthropy in the public imagination. One of the most visible recent figures, Jacob Rothschild, the fourth Baron Rothschild, was known as a financier and major arts and heritage patron in Britain. He died on February 26, 2024, and obituaries emphasized not just banking lineage, but his roles in cultural institutions and philanthropy. So, what is the credible takeaway? The Rothschilds were not sorcerers pulling invisible strings. They were a highly competent, unusually well-positioned banking dynasty that grew during an age when war, empire, and industrialization demanded new kinds of capital, and when moving money across borders quickly was as valuable as moving troops. They benefited from networks, speed, information, and trust. They also operated inside systems that produced enormous human suffering, including imperial conquest and economic extraction, and they profited from the architecture of states whose moral record was often brutal. At times, members of the family were also involved in relief efforts and philanthropy, because the same wealth that can stabilize a government can also fund hospitals, art, or famine relief. The truth is complex, which is exactly why it's worth telling straight. And maybe that's the final irony. For 2 centuries, people have tried to turn the Rothschild story into a simple plot, with a villain, a hero, and a hidden lever that moves the world. But the real story is more unsettling and more educational. Modern history is often moved by paperwork, credit, and confidence. By who can fund the next war, the next railway, the next canal, the next reconstruction. Empires aren't built only by soldiers. They're built by supply chains, debt instruments, and the quiet signatures at the bottom of a loan agreement. When Disraeli needed Suez, he didn't send a fleet first. He sent for financing.